What happens when motherhood becomes a battlefield of jealousy and dark secrets? In the suffocating silence of a colonial manor, two women's destinies collide over a newborn child, unleashing a storm that will shake the very foundations of their world. If you're ready for a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of the manor house, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. In the nursery, a scene of apparent tranquility unfolded, yet beneath its surface a storm was brewing. Margaret Whitmore sat rigidly in her mahogany chair, her pale hands gripping the armrests as she watched Celeste, the young enslaved woman, gently cradle her 3-week-old daughter, Eleanor. The baby's soft suckling sounds filled the room, a melody that should have brought comfort to any mother's heart. Instead, it sent daggers of inexplicable pain through Margaret's chest. The nursery itself was a testament to wealth and expectation. Hand-carved furniture imported from England adorned the space, while delicate lace curtains framed windows that overlooked the sprawling cotton fields. A rocking horse sat in the corner, waiting for Eleanor to grow old enough to ride it, and shelves lined with leather-bound children's books promised years of bedtime stories. Everything had been prepared for the perfect childhood, yet the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. "She's feeding well today, Ma'am," Celeste whispered, her voice barely audible, careful not to disturb the peaceful moment. Her dark skin glistened with a healthy glow, her movements fluid and natural as she adjusted the baby's position. Despite her youth, she couldn't have been more than 19, there was a maternal wisdom in her touch that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. Margaret's jaw tightened. "I can see that," she replied curtly, her blue eyes never leaving the intimate scene before her. She noticed how Celeste's fingers instinctively stroked Eleanor's tiny hand, how she hummed softly under her breath, how the baby seemed to mold perfectly against her body, as if they had been designed to fit together. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 weeks ago, when complications during childbirth had left her unable to nurse, she had been grateful, no, desperate, for Celeste's help. The young woman had recently given birth herself, though her own child had been stillborn, a tragedy that seemed to make her even more devoted to little Eleanor. At first, Margaret had seen it as providence, a gift from God in her darkest hour, but gratitude had slowly transformed into something darker, something Margaret couldn't name or understand. Each day, as she watched Celeste perform the most intimate act of motherhood with such natural grace, a poison had begun to seep into her heart. It started as a whisper of inadequacy. Why couldn't she provide for her own child? And had grown into something more sinister. "Perhaps you'd like to hold her now, ma'am," Celeste offered, beginning to lift the satisfied baby from her breast. Her movements were gentle, reverent, as if she were handling the most precious treasure in the world. "No." The word came out sharper than Margaret intended, causing Celeste to freeze mid-motion. "Continue with your duties." The word duties hung in the air like an accusation, reducing the tender moment to a mere transaction. Celeste's eyes flickered with confusion and hurt, but she nodded obediently. This wasn't the first time this week that Mrs. Whitmore had refused to hold her own child after feeding time. The other house servants had begun to whisper, though they were careful to keep their voices low when the mistress was near. Margaret rose abruptly from her chair, the sudden movement causing her black mourning dress to rustle like autumn leaves. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet nursery, and Eleanor stirred slightly in Celeste's arms. "I'll be in the library. Send for me when you're finished." As she swept from the room, Margaret caught her reflection in the ornate mirror by the door. At 23, she looked older, worn down by grief, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Her auburn hair, once her pride and joy, was now pulled back severely in a style that spoke of duty rather than beauty. Her once bright eyes had dulled to the color of winter sky, and her skin had taken on the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors, brooding. The hallway stretched before her like a gallery of memories. Portraits of Whitmore ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to judge her every step. She passed the room where Charles had died just 6 weeks ago, the door still closed, as if sealing away not just his memory, but her former life. The house felt too large now, too empty, filled with echoes of laughter that would never return. The library had been her husband's sanctuary, and now it served as her refuge. The smell of leather-bound books and tobacco still lingered, a ghost of Charles's presence that both comforted and tormented her. She moved to his desk, running her fingers along its polished surface, remembering how he used to sit there, managing the plantation's affairs with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. He had been respected by his peers, feared by his slaves, and adored by his wife, or so she had thought. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Margaret pulled out Charles's chair and sat down, feeling dwarfed by the massive piece of furniture. Everything in this room spoke of masculine authority, from the heavy oak bookcases to the mounted hunting trophies that adorned the walls. She had always felt like an intruder here during Charles's lifetime, and that feeling had only intensified since his death. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, not turning from the window that overlooked the cotton fields, where dozens of enslaved workers moved between the rows like dark shadows against the white boles. "Mom?" It was Sarah, the head house servant, her weathered face creased with concern. Sarah had been with the plantation for over 20 years, arriving as a young woman and growing old in service to the Whitmore family. Her greying hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her simple brown dress was spotless despite the day's work. "Is everything all right? You seem troubled." Margaret finally turned, her expression carefully composed. "I'm perfectly fine, Sarah, just tired." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they were a lie. She wasn't just tired. She was drowning in emotions she couldn't understand or control. But Sarah had known Margaret since she was a bride of 18, brought to this plantation with stars in her eyes and love in her heart. She could see the lie in the younger woman's posture, in the way her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts, in the hollow look that had taken residence in her eyes. "Perhaps you should spend more time with little Eleanor," Sarah suggested gently, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen many mothers struggle with the challenges of new parenthood. "It might help with the grieving process. A mother's bond with her child can be healing, especially during times of loss." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "A mother's bond," she repeated, her voice hollow. "Yes, I suppose it can be." But as she spoke, all she could see was Celeste's serene face as she nourished Eleanor, the natural ease with which she held the child, the way Eleanor seemed to calm instantly in her arms. It was a bond Margaret felt increasingly excluded from, despite being the child's biological mother. How could she compete with someone who could provide what she could not? "The other servants," Sarah continued carefully, "they're concerned about you, ma'am, about the way you've been, distant from the baby." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "The servants would do well to mind their own business. They care about you, Mum, about the family, we all do." Sarah's voice remained gentle despite Margaret's sharp tone. "But watching you pull away from your own child, it's heartbreaking." "Heartbreaking?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "You want to know what's heartbreaking, Sarah? Watching another woman mother your child better than you ever could. Watching your daughter respond to a stranger's touch with more contentment than she's ever shown you." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and painful. Sarah's expression softened with understanding, but Margaret turned away before she could see the pity in the older woman's eyes. That evening, as the plantation settled into its nightly rhythm, Margaret found herself standing outside the nursery door, listening to Celeste's soft humming as she rocked Eleanor to sleep. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, an old spiritual that spoke of hope and endurance, of finding light in the darkest places. The words, sung in a voice like honey over gravel, told of rivers to cross and mountains to climb, of a promised land where suffering would end. Margaret pushed the door open slightly, watching through the crack as Celeste placed the sleeping baby in her crib with infinite tenderness. The young woman's face was illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamp, and Margaret was struck by her beauty, not just physical but something deeper, a radiance that seemed to come from within. For a moment, the scene looked so perfect, so complete, that Margaret felt like an intruder in her own home. "Sleep well, little angel," Celeste whispered, her hand gently stroking Eleanor's downy hair. Your mama loves you so much. But which mama was she referring to? The question burned in Margaret's mind as she retreated to her own room, where sleep would elude her once again. The four-poster bed that had once been a sanctuary shared with Charles now felt like a vast cold ocean, where she drifted alone with her thoughts. As the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling where shadows danced in the moonlight. The jealousy that had taken root in her heart was growing stronger each day, fed by grief, loneliness, and something else, a nagging feeling that there were secrets in this house, secrets that somehow connected to Charles's death and Celeste's presence in their lives. She thought about the way Charles had insisted on bringing Celeste to the main house when her pregnancy became difficult, claiming it was for her health. She remembered his unusual interest in the young woman's welfare, his insistence that she receive the best care available. At the time, Margaret had attributed it to Christian charity, but now she wondered if there had been something more. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending tree branches scraping against the glass like skeletal fingers. The sound made Margaret shiver, pulling the covers closer around her shoulders. But no amount of warmth could chase away the cold that had settled in her heart, a chill that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. She didn't yet understand the full scope of what she was feeling, but one thing was becoming clear. The peaceful coexistence she had initially been grateful for was crumbling, and in its place something dangerous was taking shape. The foundation of her world was shifting, and she could feel herself falling into an abyss of suspicion and rage that threatened to consume everything in its path. The following morning brought with it a suffocating humidity that seemed to press down on the plantation like a heavy blanket. Margaret woke with a headache that pounded behind her temples, a physical manifestation of the turmoil brewing within her. The sheets were damp with perspiration, and her nightgown clung uncomfortably to her skin, making her feel trapped even in the privacy of her own bedroom. She dressed mechanically, choosing another black dress from her limited wardrobe of mourning attire. The fabric was heavy and unforgiving, a constant reminder of her loss and her duty to grieve publicly for the appropriate amount of time. As she pinned her hair back with trembling fingers, she caught sight of herself in the mirror again. When had she become so pale, so hollow-looking? When had the spark in her eyes died completely? The woman staring back at her was a stranger, aged beyond her years by sorrow and something darker. The sound of Eleanor's crying drifted through the walls, and Margaret felt her body respond instinctively. Her breasts ached with the phantom sensation of milk she could no longer produce. The cruel irony of her situation hit her anew. She was a mother who couldn't mother, dependent on another woman to fulfill the most basic maternal function. Her body had failed her when she needed it most, leaving her feeling broken and inadequate. She made her way downstairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The house felt different in the morning light, less oppressive, but somehow more melancholy. Dust particles danced in the sunbeams that streamed through the tall windows, and the silence was broken only by the distant sounds of the plantation coming to life. The lowing of cattle, the voices of field hands beginning their daily labor, the creak of wagon wheels on the dirt roads. By the time she reached the nursery, Celeste was already there, lifting Eleanor from her crib with practiced ease. The baby's cries ceased almost immediately, replaced by contented gurgling, as Celeste began to prepare for the morning feeding. Margaret paused in the doorway, watching the transformation that came over her daughter in Celeste's arms. It was as if the young woman possessed some magical ability to soothe and comfort that Margaret herself lacked. "Good morning, ma'am," Celeste said softly, not quite meeting Margaret's eyes. There was a new tension in her voice, a wariness that hadn't been there before. She had begun to sense the change in her mistress. The way Margaret's gaze had grown cold and calculating, the way her presence in the nursery had become oppressive rather than comforting. Margaret stepped into the room, her black dress rustling against the doorframe. "Is she well?" she asked, her tone clipped and formal, as if she were inquiring about a piece of property rather than her own child. "Yes, ma'am. She slept through the night. She's growing stronger every day." Celeste's voice carried a note of pride that made Margaret's chest tighten with an emotion she was beginning to recognize as envy. How dare this woman take pride in her daughter's progress? How dare she speak as if she had any claim to Eleanor's well-being? Margaret watched as Celeste settled into the rocking chair, adjusting her simple cotton dress to accommodate the feeding. The ease with which she performed this intimate act made Margaret's chest tighten with resentment. Everything about the scene spoke of natural maternal instinct, of a bond that transcended mere duty or obligation. The way Celeste's body curved protectively around Eleanor, the gentle murmur of her voice as she whispered endearments, the look of pure contentment on both their faces, it was everything Margaret had dreamed motherhood would be, and everything she felt incapable of providing. "How long did you nurse your own child?" The question slipped out before Margaret could stop herself, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a blade. She immediately regretted asking, but some perverse part of her needed to know, needed to understand what she was competing against. Celeste's hand stilled for a moment, pain flickering across her features like a shadow passing over the sun. "Only a few hours, ma'am. He didn't survive the night." Her voice was barely a whisper, heavy with a grief that Margaret recognized all too well. The loss of a child was a wound that never fully healed, a constant ache that colored every moment of existence. "I see." Margaret's voice was cold, devoid of the sympathy such a revelation should have evoked. Instead of feeling compassion for Celeste's loss, she felt only a twisted satisfaction that the other woman had suffered too. "And yet you seem so natural at this." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with implications that neither woman fully understood yet. Celeste looked up, confusion and hurt evident in her dark eyes. The accusation in Margaret's tone was unmistakable, though its exact meaning remained unclear. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Have I done something wrong?" Celeste's voice was small, uncertain, like a child seeking reassurance from a parent who had suddenly turned cold and distant. "Wrong?" Margaret laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. It was harsh and bitter, like the cry of a wounded animal. "No, Celeste, you've done everything perfectly, perhaps too perfectly." The accusation was vague but loaded with meaning that neither woman fully understood yet. Celeste lowered her gaze, focusing on Eleanor, who was feeding contentedly, oblivious to the tension crackling between the two women who cared for her. The baby's innocence seemed to highlight the growing darkness in the room, a stark contrast to the adult emotions swirling around her. As the days passed, Margaret's behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. She would hover in the nursery during feeding times, her presence making Celeste nervous and uncomfortable. The young woman began to feel like she was performing under constant scrutiny, every movement watched and judged. Margaret's eyes followed her with an intensity that was both possessive and hostile, as if she were trying to find fault with everything Celeste did. She began issuing contradictory orders, first insisting that Eleanor be brought to her immediately after feeding, then changing her mind and demanding to be left alone when Celeste appeared at her door with the baby. One moment she would criticize Celeste for being too familiar with Eleanor. The next she would accuse her of being cold and distant. The young woman found herself walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of her mistress she would encounter. The other servants noticed the change and began to whisper among themselves when they thought Margaret couldn't hear. Conversations would stop when she entered a room, and worried glances were exchanged when they thought she wasn't looking. The atmosphere in the house grew thick with unspoken tension, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Sarah, in particular, watched her young mistress with growing concern. She had seen grief do strange things to people before, but this was different. There was something almost predatory in the way Margaret watched Celeste, something that spoke of deeper issues than simple mourning. "Something ain't right with Miss Margaret," she confided to Thomas, the elderly butler, who had served the Whitmore family for over 30 years. They were standing in the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones while the cook prepared the evening meal. "She's got a look in her eyes that troubles me deeply." Thomas nodded gravely, his weathered hands folding and unfolding a dish towel as he considered his words. "Grief can do strange things to a person's mind, and she's been through more than most, losing her husband so young, nearly dying in childbirth herself, then being unable to nurse her own child. It's enough to break anyone." "But it's more than grief," Sarah insisted, her voice dropping even lower. The way she looks at Celeste, it's like she hates her. But why? The girl's done nothing but help, nothing but care for that baby like it was her own. Maybe that's the problem, Thomas said quietly. Maybe she cares too much. But it wasn't just grief that was driving Margaret's behavior. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the servants had retired to their quarters, she found herself going through Charles's papers with increasing desperation, searching for something she couldn't name. There were ledgers detailing the plantation's finances, correspondence with other landowners, records of slave purchases and sales. But there were gaps, inconsistencies that nagged at her like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. She discovered receipts for medical expenses that didn't correspond to any illness she remembered, payments to doctors in distant towns for consultations that Charles had never mentioned. There were also several letters from Charleston, written in a feminine hand that she didn't recognize, speaking of delicate matters and arrangements that needed to be made discreetly. One evening, as she sat in the library surrounded by documents, she came across a letter dated just 2 months before Charles's death. It was from a doctor in Charleston, confirming an appointment for a delicate matter that required the utmost discretion. The letter was vague, but something about its tone made Margaret's blood run cold. Why would Charles need to see a doctor in secret? What kind of delicate matter required such secrecy? She was so absorbed in the letter that she didn't hear the soft footsteps in the hallway. It was only when she heard Eleanor's faint crying that she realized how late it had become. The grandfather clock in the corner showed nearly midnight, and the house had settled into its nightly quiet. Rising from the desk, she moved toward the nursery, the letter still clutched in her hand like a piece of damning evidence. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see Celeste walking back and forth, gently bouncing Eleanor in her arms. The young woman's movements were fluid and graceful, like a dancer performing a well-rehearsed routine. But it wasn't the sight of them together that stopped Margaret in her tracks. It was what Celeste was singing. It was a lullaby, but not just any lullaby. It was one that Charles used to hum when he thought no one was listening, a melody he claimed his mother had sung to him as a child. Margaret had only heard it a few times, always late at night when Charles was deep in his cups and feeling nostalgic. The tune was haunting and melancholy, speaking of lost love and distant shores, of dreams that would never come true. How could Celeste know that song? The question hit Margaret like a physical blow, making her stumble backward from the door. Her heart began to race as the implications sank in. That melody was private, intimate, something that should have been known only to the Whitmore family. For Celeste to know it meant. Margaret's grip tightened on the letter as a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known existed started to fall into place. Charles's frequent visits to the slave quarters, his insistence on personally selecting Celeste when she was brought to the plantation, the way his eyes would linger on her when he thought no one was watching. The mysterious medical appointments, the secretive correspondence, the unusual attention he had paid to Celeste's welfare during her pregnancy, and now this, a lullaby that should have been known only to the Whitmore family, being sung by a woman who was supposed to be nothing more than a wet nurse. The coincidence was too great to ignore, the implications too terrible to contemplate. Margaret backed away from the door, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would wake the entire house. She stumbled back to the library, the letter falling from her trembling fingers as the full implications of her discovery crashed over her like a tidal wave. If her suspicions were correct, then Celeste wasn't just caring for Eleanor out of duty or even kindness. There was a connection, a bond that went deeper than anyone knew, a secret that Charles had taken to his grave, but one that lived on in a simple lullaby, and the gentle way Celeste held a child who might be more than just her charge. As dawn broke over the plantation, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret sat in Charles's chair, staring at the letter on the floor. The jealousy that had been eating at her for weeks now had a focus, a target. But with that focus came a rage so pure and consuming that it threatened to burn away everything in its path. The game had changed. This was no longer about a mother's jealousy over her child's wet nurse. This was about betrayal, secrets, and a truth that could destroy everything Margaret thought she knew about her life, her marriage, and her child. And Celeste, innocent or not, was about to become the target of a fury that had been building since the moment Margaret first watched her cradle Eleanor with such natural, inexplicable love. The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow, leaving her gasping for air in the suffocating confines of the library. The lullaby echoed in her mind, each note a confirmation of her worst fears, each word a dagger twisting deeper into her already wounded heart. She spent the remainder of the night pacing the room like a caged animal, her mind racing through memories, searching for signs she had missed, clues she had been too blind or too trusting to see. The morning light filtering through the windows seemed harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the chaos of papers scattered across Charles's desk. Margaret had torn through every document, every letter, every scrap of correspondence, looking for more evidence of what she now believed to be an elaborate deception. Her hands were stained with ink, her dress wrinkled from the night's frantic search, but she had found enough to confirm her suspicions. Charles's late-night walks to the slave quarters, which he had explained as checking on the workers, now took on a sinister new meaning. His insistence on bringing Celeste to the main house when she was pregnant, claiming it was for her health, seemed like a calculated move to keep his mistress close. The way his face had changed when news came of her stillborn child, not just sympathy, but something deeper, more personal, now made perfect sense. And now Eleanor, her precious daughter, was being nursed by a woman who might be more than a stranger. The thought made Margaret's stomach churn with a mixture of rage and disgust that threatened to overwhelm her completely. How long had this been going on? How long had Charles been living a lie, making a mockery of their marriage vows while she remained blissfully ignorant? She found more evidence as the morning progressed, receipts for expensive fabrics that had never appeared in the main house, payments to a seamstress for special orders that Margaret had never seen, medical bills for prenatal care that far exceeded what would be normal for a slave. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of her marriage, another confirmation that the man she had loved and trusted had been living a double life. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret made her decision. She would confront Celeste, demand the truth, and put an end to this charade once and for all. The rage that consumed her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was primal, destructive, a force of nature that demanded satisfaction. She found Celeste in the kitchen garden, picking herbs for the morning meal, while Eleanor slept peacefully in a wicker basket beside her. The scene was almost pastoral in its tranquility, which only served to fuel Margaret's anger. How dare this woman appear so serene, so content, when she had been part of such a massive deception? How dare she tend to the garden, as if she belonged here, as if she had any right to the peace and security of the plantation? The garden itself was a testament to careful cultivation, neat rows of herbs and vegetables, fruit trees heavy with summer bounty, flowers blooming in carefully planned arrangements. It had been Margaret's pride and joy when she first arrived as a bride, a place where she could create beauty and nurture life. Now it felt tainted, corrupted by the presence of the woman who had stolen her husband's affections. Celeste. Her voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. The young woman looked up, startled by the harsh tone. Her hands were dirty from the soil, her simple dress stained with earth and morning dew. There was an innocence about her that Margaret now saw as calculated, a facade designed to hide her true nature. "Yes, ma'am. Is something wrong?" Margaret approached slowly, her black dress billowing behind her like storm clouds. Each step was deliberate, measured, like a predator stalking its prey. "That song you were singing last night, where did you learn it?" Confusion flickered across Celeste's face, but Margaret caught something else there too, a flash of fear, quickly hidden but unmistakable. "Song, ma'am? I sing many songs to help Miss Eleanor sleep." "Don't lie to me." Margaret's voice was dangerously low, vibrating with barely controlled fury. "The lullaby, the one about the mockingbird and the diamond ring, where did you learn it?" Celeste's hands stilled on the herbs, and for a moment something like panic flashed in her eyes. She glanced toward the basket where Eleanor slept, as if seeking protection from the innocent child. I don't remember, Mum. Perhaps I heard it somewhere. You heard it from my husband. The accusation hung in the air between them, like a sword ready to fall, sharp and deadly. Didn't you? The colour drained from Celeste's face, and Margaret knew she had hit her mark. The young woman's silence was confirmation enough, more damning than any confession could have been. Margaret felt a savage satisfaction at finally having her suspicions confirmed, even as her heart broke a little more. "How long?" Margaret demanded, stepping closer until she loomed over the kneeling woman. "How long were you warming his bed while I slept in mine, believing myself to be a beloved wife?" "Ma'am, please." Celeste's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with fear and something that might have been shame. "How long?" Margaret's voice rose to a shout, causing birds to scatter from the nearby trees and Eleanor to stir restlessly in her basket. The sound echoed across the garden, carrying her pain and rage to anyone within hearing distance. Celeste glanced nervously at the baby, then back at Margaret. Her eyes were wide with terror, like a deer caught in a hunter's sights. It wasn't like that, Ma'am. Master Charles, he was kind to me, but—" "Kind?" Margaret laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken. "Is that what you call it? Adultery? Betrayal? The destruction of a marriage and a family? Please, Ma'am, you'll wake the baby." "The baby?" Margaret's eyes fixed on Eleanor's sleeping form, and a terrible thought began to take shape in her mind, growing like a cancer that threatened to consume everything in its path. "Tell me, Celeste, when exactly did your child die?" Celeste's breath caught in her throat, and Margaret could see the fear growing in her eyes. "Ma'am, your stillborn son. When did he die? Before Eleanor was born? After? Or—" Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than her earlier shouts. "Did he die at all? I don't understand what you're asking." "I think you understand perfectly." Margaret's voice was deadly quiet now, each word carefully enunciated and dripping with venom. "I think there was no stillborn son. I think you gave birth to a healthy child, a child you've been caring for all along, pretending it was mine." The accusation was so shocking, so devastating, that for a moment neither woman could speak. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath, the very air thick with tension and unspoken truths. Celeste's face had gone ashen, and her hands trembled as she reached instinctively toward the basket, a gesture that Margaret interpreted as confirmation of her worst fears. "She's not yours," Celeste whispered, but her voice lacked conviction, and Margaret could hear the lie in every syllable. "Isn't she?" Margaret's eyes blazed with fury that seemed to burn everything in its path. "Look at her, Celeste, really look at her. She has Charles's nose, his chin, the same stubborn set to her jaw, and she responds to you like you're her real mother." The truth hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Eleanor wasn't just Margaret's daughter being nursed by Celeste. She was potentially Celeste's daughter, switched at birth in a desperate attempt to save her from a life of slavery. The implications were staggering. The betrayal so complete that Margaret felt as if the ground beneath her feet was crumbling away. "You switched them," Margaret breathed, the pieces finally falling into place with sickening clarity. "Your child and mine. My daughter is dead, buried in some unmarked grave, and I've been raising yours, loving yours, believing she was my own flesh and blood." "No." Celeste's composure finally cracked, her voice rising in desperate denial. "No, ma'am, that's not. I would never." But her denial was weak, unconvincing, and Margaret could see the truth in her eyes. The woman she had trusted with her most precious possession had been deceiving her from the very beginning, participating in a conspiracy that went to the very heart of her identity as a mother and a wife. "Where is she?" Margaret demanded, her voice breaking with grief and rage. "Where is my real daughter? What did you do with her?" Celeste's silence was answer enough. Margaret felt something break inside her chest, a sound like glass shattering in the depths of her soul. Her real daughter was gone, had been gone from the moment of birth, and she had been unknowingly caring for the child of her husband's mistress, pouring her love and devotion into a lie. The rage that consumed her then was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was primal, destructive, a force of nature that demanded satisfaction and would not be denied. It burned through her veins like molten metal, consuming rational thought and leaving only the need for revenge. "You will leave," she said, her voice eerily calm despite the storm raging within her. "You will leave this plantation immediately and never return." "But the baby is not your concern anymore." Margaret's eyes were cold as winter steel, devoid of any trace of the compassion that had once defined her. "You have no claim to her. You are nothing but a slave who has overstepped her bounds and forgotten her place. Please, ma'am, she needs me. She needs to nurse. She will learn to take a bottle, or she will starve. Either way, it's no longer your problem." The words came out flat and emotionless, as if Margaret were discussing the weather rather than the life of a child. Celeste fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she begged for mercy that would not come. "Please, I'm begging you. Don't separate us. I love her." "Love?" Margaret's laugh was harsh and bitter, like the cry of a wounded animal. "You don't know the meaning of the word. You're a thief, a liar, and a whore, and you will get exactly what you deserve." The confrontation had drawn the attention of other servants, who watched from a distance with horrified fascination. They had never seen their mistress like this, consumed by a rage that seemed to transform her into someone else entirely. Sarah stepped forward, her face pale with shock and concern. "Miss Margaret, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "There's nothing to discuss." Margaret's voice brooked no argument, carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her target for all the pain and loss she had endured. "Celeste is to be removed from this property immediately. And the child—" She looked down at Eleanor, who had begun to fuss, sensing the tension around her. "The child will learn to do without her." As the servants reluctantly moved to carry out Margaret's orders, Celeste made one last desperate plea. "She's innocent in all this. Whatever you think of me, don't punish her. She's just a baby who needs love and care." Margaret looked down at the woman kneeling before her, and for a moment something like pity flickered in her eyes. But it was quickly consumed by the fire of her rage, burned away by the magnitude of the betrayal she had discovered. "She's a reminder of everything I've lost," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a finality that chilled everyone who heard it. "And I can't bear to look at her anymore." The words hung in the air like a death sentence as Celeste was led away, her sobs echoing across the plantation grounds. Eleanor's cries grew louder, more desperate, as if she somehow understood that her world was being torn apart by forces beyond her comprehension. Margaret stood alone in the garden, surrounded by the herbs Celeste had been picking, watching as the only mother Eleanor had ever known disappeared from their lives forever. The victory felt hollow, poisoned by the knowledge that in destroying Celeste, she might very well be destroying the child she had claimed to protect. But it was too late for regrets. The storm had broken, and in its wake, nothing would ever be the same. The truth had been revealed, but instead of bringing peace, it had only brought more pain, more loss, more reasons to question everything she thought she knew about love, family, and the bonds that tie people together. As Eleanor's cries echoed through the morning air, Margaret realized that in her quest for revenge, she might have destroyed the very thing she was trying to save. But the rage still burned too bright for her to see clearly, and the path back to sanity seemed impossibly far away. 3 days had passed since Celeste's banishment, and the plantation house felt like a tomb, shrouded in an oppressive silence that seemed to seep into every corner, every crevice. The very walls seemed to absorb the sound of Eleanor's cries, which echoed through the halls day and night, like the wailing of a lost soul. The baby refused the bottle with a determination that bordered on the supernatural. Refused. The wet nurse hastily brought from a neighboring plantation with such vehemence that the woman had fled in tears, refused everything except what she could no longer have. Margaret sat in her bedroom, staring out at the fields where the cotton grew in neat, orderly rows, a stark contrast to the disorder consuming her life. The irony wasn't lost on her that the very crop that had built their fortune was tended by the same people she had just torn apart with her rage. The workers moved through the fields like ghosts, their heads down, their movements mechanical. Word of what had happened had spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, and the atmosphere on the plantation had grown thick with fear and uncertainty. The other servants moved through the house like spectres, speaking in whispers when they spoke at all, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and judgment that Margaret could feel like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. They had seen their mistress transform from a grieving widow into something else entirely, something that frightened them in ways they couldn't fully articulate. Sarah knocked softly on the door before entering, her weathered face etched with lines of worry that seemed to have deepened overnight. "Ma'am, the baby. She's getting weaker. She hasn't taken any nourishment since yesterday morning." Her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering, who understood that they were witnessing a tragedy unfold in real time. Margaret didn't turn from the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. "Then find another way." Her voice was flat, emotionless, as if she were discussing a broken piece of furniture rather than a dying child. "We've tried everything, Ma'am. The goat's milk, the sugar water, even the wet nurse from the Morrison plantation. She won't take anything. She's pining, Ma'am. Like she knows something's wrong." Sarah's voice broke slightly on the last words, her maternal instincts crying out at the sight of a child slowly fading away. "Then she'll have to learn." Margaret's reflection in the window showed a woman who looked like she had aged years in just 3 days. Her skin was pale and drawn, her eyes sunken with exhaustion and something darker. "Ma'am, she needs Celeste." The name slipped out before Sarah could stop herself, and she immediately regretted it as Margaret's shoulders tensed like a bowstring. The name hit Margaret like a physical blow, sending a jolt of pain and rage through her already battered heart. "That woman is never to be mentioned in this house again." Her voice cracked like a whip, and Sarah retreated a step, recognizing the dangerous edge that had crept into her mistress's tone. "But, Ma'am, never again." Margaret's voice rose to a shout that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The sound was so raw, so filled with pain and fury, that Sarah retreated immediately, closing the door softly behind her and leaving Margaret alone with her demons. Alone again, Margaret allowed herself to truly listen to Eleanor's cries for the first time in days. They were weaker now, more desperate, the sound of a child slowly fading away like a candle guttering in the wind. The realization that she might be killing the only child she had left, regardless of whose blood ran through her veins, began to penetrate the armor of rage she had built around her heart. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the room that seemed to reach toward her, like accusing fingers. Margaret found herself remembering Eleanor's first days of life, how small and fragile she had seemed, how miraculous it had felt to hold her own child after the difficult birth. Those memories now felt tainted, corrupted by the knowledge of what had come after, but they still carried an emotional weight that she couldn't entirely dismiss. She thought about Charles, about the man she had loved and married, and tried to reconcile that memory with the betrayer she now believed him to be. Had any of it been real? Had he ever truly loved her, or had she been nothing more than a convenient facade, a respectable wife to hide his true desires? The questions tormented her, eating away at her sanity like acid. That evening, as the sun set over the plantation in a blaze of orange and red that seemed to mirror the fire in her heart, Thomas approached Margaret in the library. His weathered face was grave, his usual deference replaced by something that looked almost like defiance. The old butler had served the Whitmore family faithfully for 3 decades, had seen them through good times and bad, and had never once questioned their authority. But this was different. "Ma'am, I've served this family for 30 years, he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I served your husband's father before him, and I've seen this plantation through droughts and floods, through prosperity and hardship." Margaret looked up from the ledger she had been pretending to read, her eyes focusing on Thomas with difficulty. The numbers on the page had been swimming before her eyes, meaningless figures that couldn't distract her from the sound of Eleanor's weakening cries. "What's your point, Thomas?" "My point, ma'am, is that I've never seen anything as cruel as what you're doing to that child." The accusation hung in the air between them, bold and uncompromising. Thomas had never spoken to her this way before, had never challenged her authority so directly. The words hit Margaret like a slap, causing her to straighten in her chair. "How dare you? I dare because someone has to speak the truth in this house." Thomas's voice grew stronger, fueled by a righteous anger that had been building for days. "I dare because I've watched that baby grow weaker every hour, and I can't stand by and watch her die because of your pride." Pride. Margaret's voice was dangerous, low and threatening. "You think this is about pride. I don't know what this is about, Mum, and frankly it's not my place to judge. But that baby upstairs is innocent. She's dying, Ma'am, and you're letting it happen out of spite." Thomas's words were like hammer blows, each one driving home the reality of what was happening. "How dare you speak to me this way? I dare because someone has to speak for that child." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes blazing with an intensity that Margaret had never seen before. Master Charles may have made mistakes, but he never would have let a child suffer for the sins of adults. The mention of Charles hit Margaret like a physical blow, causing her to gasp and clutch at the arms of her chair. "Don't you dare speak of my husband. You know nothing about what he did, about how he betrayed me, about how he made a mockery of our marriage." "I know more than you think, Ma'am." Thomas's admission stopped Margaret cold, her heart skipping a beat as she stared at the old man. "I know about his visits to the quarters. I know about Celeste. And I know about the night both babies were born." Margaret's blood turned to ice, her vision narrowing until all she could see was Thomas's weathered face. "What are you saying?" Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Thomas sighed heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. The weight of the secrets he had carried seemed to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. "I'm saying that the truth is more complicated than your anger wants it to be. Tell me." The words came out as a whisper, barely audible above the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Thomas moved to the window, looking out at the slave quarters in the distance, where smoke rose from cooking fires and the sounds of evening activities drifted on the warm air. Master Charles did care for Celeste, that much is true, but it wasn't what you think. She reminded him of someone, his sister, who died when they were children. He was trying to protect her, not seduce her. Margaret felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, her carefully constructed narrative of betrayal beginning to crumble. "That's impossible." The lullaby was one he taught her when she was grieving her own mother's death. He thought it might bring her comfort, help her through the darkest time of her life. Thomas turned back to Margaret, his eyes filled with sadness and something that might have been pity. "The night you gave birth, there were complications. You were unconscious for hours, bleeding badly. We thought we might lose you both." "Both?" Margaret's voice was barely a breath, her world tilting on its axis as the truth began to emerge. "You and the baby. Eleanor was born weak, barely breathing. The doctor didn't think she would survive the night." Thomas paused, gathering his courage for what came next. Celeste had given birth that same night to a healthy son. When she saw Eleanor struggling, when she saw how weak and fragile she was, she offered to nurse her, to give her strength. Margaret's world tilted on its axis, everything she thought she knew crumbling like a house of cards in a strong wind. What happened to Celeste's son? He lived for 3 days, long enough for Eleanor to grow strong, to fight for life. When he died, Celeste was heartbroken, but she kept nursing Eleanor. She said it was what God wanted, that she was meant to save your daughter. Thomas's voice was gentle now, filled with the weight of a truth that had been hidden for too long. The truth hit Margaret like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping. There had been no switch, no deception, no elaborate conspiracy. Eleanor was her biological daughter, and Celeste had been nothing more than a grieving mother who had chosen to save another woman's child at the cost of her own heart. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Margaret's voice was barely audible, broken by the magnitude of her mistake. "Master Charles wanted to, but you were so weak, so fragile after the birth. He was afraid the truth would break you, that knowing how close you came to losing Eleanor would be too much to bear. And then, when you started to recover, he died so suddenly." Thomas's voice carried the weight of regret, of secrets that should have been shared but never were. Margaret remembered Charles's final days, how he had seemed to want to tell her something important but could never find the words. She had thought it was just the fever talking, the delirium of a dying man, but now she understood he had been trying to confess a kindness, not a betrayal. "What have I done?" The words escaped her lips like a prayer, filled with horror and regret that threatened to consume her entirely. The magnitude of her mistake crashed over her like a tidal wave, washing away the anger and leaving only devastating clarity in its wake. "Something that can still be fixed," Thomas said gently, his voice carrying a note of hope that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "If you act quickly." Margaret rose from her chair on unsteady legs, her body trembling with the shock of revelation. "Where is she? Where did they take Celeste?" "To the Johnson plantation, about 10 miles south. But, Ma'am, you should know, she's been sold. Mr. Johnson bought her to work his fields." The news hit Margaret like another blow, the realization that in her rage she had not only banished Celeste, but had her sold like property, separating her forever from the child she had saved and loved. "Get the carriage ready," Margaret ordered, her voice gaining strength as purpose replaced despair. "Now." "Ma'am, it's nearly dark." "Now, Thomas, and send word to Dr. Morrison. Tell him to come immediately. Eleanor will need medical attention when we return." Margaret was already moving toward the door, her mind racing as she tried to calculate how much time they had, how much damage her pride and anger had done. As Thomas hurried to carry out her orders, Margaret ran upstairs to the nursery. Eleanor lay in her crib, pale and still, her breathing shallow and labored. Margaret picked her up for the first time in days, feeling how light she had become, how fragile. The baby's skin was almost translucent, her lips dry and cracked from dehydration. "I'm sorry," she whispered against the baby's downy hair, her tears falling like rain on the small, still form. "I'm so sorry, my darling. Mama's going to fix this. I promise I'm going to fix this." The carriage ride to the Johnson plantation felt like an eternity, every minute stretching like an hour as Margaret held Eleanor close, willing her to hold on just a little longer. The baby's breathing was so faint that several times Margaret had to check to make sure she was still alive, her heart stopping each time until she felt the flutter of breath against her cheek. The countryside rolled past in a blur of darkness and moonlight, the familiar landscape transformed into something alien and threatening by the urgency of their mission. Margaret found herself praying for the first time since Charles's death, bargaining with God for her daughter's life, promising to be better, to do better, if only Eleanor could survive her mother's terrible mistake. When they finally arrived at the Johnson plantation, Margaret didn't wait for the carriage to come to a complete stop. She leaped down, Eleanor in her arms, and ran toward the main house, her black dress billowing behind her like the wings of some desperate bird. Mr. Johnson met her at the door, his face a mask of confusion and concern. He was a portly man in his 50s with kind eyes and a reputation for treating his slaves with relative decency. "Mrs. Whitmore, what brings you here at this hour?" "The woman you bought from me, Celeste. I need her back." Margaret's voice was desperate, raw with emotion that she made no attempt to hide. Johnson's eyebrows rose in surprise. "I'm afraid that's not possible. She's been assigned to field work and—" "Name your price." Margaret's voice cut through his protests like a blade. "Whatever you paid, I'll double it, triple it." "Mrs. Whitmore, I don't understand." "My daughter is dying." Margaret held Eleanor up, and even in the dim light of the porch lantern, Johnson could see how pale and weak the child had become. Her tiny chest barely rose and fell, and her skin had taken on an alarming translucent quality. "Celeste is the only one who can save her." Something in Margaret's voice, in the raw desperation of a mother facing the loss of her child, moved Johnson to immediate action. He had children of his own, and the sight of Eleanor's condition struck him to his core. "She's in the quarters. I'll have her brought immediately." "Please hurry," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking as she felt Eleanor's breathing grow even more shallow in her arms. Johnson shouted orders to his overseer, and within minutes, the sound of running footsteps could be heard approaching the main house. Margaret's heart pounded as she waited, each second feeling like an eternity as she watched her daughter slip further away from life. When Celeste finally appeared, Margaret's heart nearly broke at the sight of her. The young woman's simple dress was dirty and torn from field work, her hands stained with soil and her face gaunt from 3 days of grief and hard labor. But when she saw Margaret holding Eleanor, her face immediately crumpled with emotion and concern. "Oh, my sweet baby," she whispered, reaching out instinctively before catching herself and dropping her hands to her sides. The longing in her voice was unmistakable, the love she felt for the child evident in every line of her body. Margaret looked into Celeste's eyes and saw not the scheming seductress she had imagined, but a young woman who had suffered tremendous loss and had chosen to channel that pain into saving another's child. The anger that had consumed her for days suddenly seemed petty and misguided in the face of Eleanor's desperate need. "Please," Margaret said, and the word came out broken, humble, stripped of all the pride and rage that had driven her actions. "Please help her. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've been cruel and unjust. But she's innocent. She needs you." Celeste looked into Margaret's eyes and saw not the angry, jealous woman who had banished her, but a terrified mother begging for her child's life. The hurt and betrayal she felt at her treatment seemed to melt away in the face of Eleanor's need. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and took Eleanor into her arms. "Let's get her home," Celeste said simply, her voice filled with the quiet strength that had sustained her through her own losses. The journey back to the plantation was a blur of whispered prayers and gentle coaxing as Celeste tried to get Eleanor to nurse. The baby was so weak that she could barely latch on, her tiny mouth working feebly as Celeste murmured encouragement and love. Margaret sat across from them in the carriage, watching with tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the bond between the woman who had saved her daughter's life and the child who had given her purpose in the darkest of times. "Come on, little angel," Celeste whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Come back to us. Your mama needs you and I need you too." It wasn't until they were back in the familiar nursery, surrounded by the scents and sounds of home, that Eleanor finally began to respond. The baby's weak cries gradually gave way to the contented sounds of feeding as she found the strength to nurse properly for the first time in days. Margaret watched from the doorway, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the reunion between the woman who had saved her daughter's life and the child who had brought them both such joy and pain. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking, a reminder of how close she had come to destroying everything that mattered. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered when Celeste looked up at her, her own eyes bright with tears of relief and exhaustion. "I'm so very sorry for what I did to you, for what I believed, for the pain I caused." Celeste nodded, her expression filled with a forgiveness that Margaret felt she didn't deserve. "She's going to be all right now, we both are." The words carried a weight of meaning that went beyond Eleanor's immediate recovery. They spoke of healing, of second chances, of the possibility that something good could emerge from the ashes of Margaret's terrible mistake. As dawn broke over the plantation, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret sat beside Celeste in the nursery, watching Eleanor sleep peacefully for the first time in days. The baby's color had already begun to return, her breathing steady and strong. The crisis had passed, but the lessons learned would last a lifetime. "Will you stay?" Margaret asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not as a slave, but as family." The word hung in the air between them, radical in its implications. In a world where the lines between black and white, slave and free, were rigidly defined, Margaret was proposing something that challenged every social convention of their time. Celeste smiled, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from her since that terrible day in the garden. It transformed her face, revealing the beauty that came from within, the strength that had sustained her through unimaginable loss. "Where else would I go? This little one needs both her mothers." And in that moment, Margaret understood that love wasn't about blood or ownership or jealousy. It was about sacrifice, forgiveness, and the courage to admit when you were wrong. Eleanor would grow up knowing she was loved by two women who had learned to put aside their differences for her sake, who had discovered that the bonds of the heart could be stronger than the bonds of blood. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake not destruction, but a new kind of family, one built on truth, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bond between a child and the women who loved her enough to save her life. Margaret had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is admitting you were wrong and fighting to make it right, even when the cost seems too high to bear. In the weeks that followed, the plantation began to heal from the trauma of those dark days. Margaret formally freed Celeste, giving her papers that made her a free woman, and offered her a position as Eleanor's governess and companion. The arrangement raised eyebrows among their neighbors, but Margaret had learned to care less about social conventions and more about what was right. Celeste accepted the offer, understanding that her freedom came with the responsibility of helping to raise the child she had saved. Together, the two women created a household unlike any other in the region, one where love transcended race and social status, where a child could grow up knowing that family was defined not by blood alone, but by the bonds of affection and sacrifice. Eleanor thrived in this environment, growing strong and healthy under the care of both her mothers. She learned to read from Margaret and to sing from Celeste, to appreciate fine literature and folk wisdom in equal measure. The lullaby that had once been a source of suspicion and pain became a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of the love that had brought them all together. Years later, visitors to the former Whitmore plantation would often comment on the unusual but beautiful sight of two women raising a child together, one teaching her letters and numbers, the other teaching her songs and stories of resilience and hope. Eleanor grew up strong and healthy, never knowing how close she had come to losing everything in those dark days, when jealousy nearly destroyed the love that saved her. Margaret and Celeste never spoke of those 3 terrible days again, but the bond forged in that crucible of truth and forgiveness lasted for the rest of their lives. They had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is admitting you were wrong and fighting to make it right, even when the cost seems unbearable. The plantation itself was eventually sold, the proceeds used to establish a school for freed slaves and their children. Margaret and Celeste moved north with Eleanor, where they could live more freely as the unconventional family they had become. They faced challenges and prejudice, but they faced them together, united by their shared love for the child who had brought them together and the hard-won wisdom that love knows no boundaries. Eleanor grew up to become a teacher herself, carrying forward the lessons of forgiveness and acceptance that her 2 mothers had taught her. She never married, choosing instead to dedicate her life to education and social reform, fighting for a world where children like herself could grow up free from the prejudices that had once threatened to tear her family apart. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of human drama, redemption, and the triumph of love over hatred. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of forgiveness, because sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we choose to build together, transcending every barrier that society tries to place between us. What did you think of Margaret's journey from jealousy to understanding? How do you think this story reflects the complexities of human relationships and the power of second chances? Let us know in the comments below, and don't miss our next story coming soon.